Welcome to Scripture and Shadows, Christianity's hidden canon. This isn't quite your standard look at Scripture. We really try to dig into texts that are foundational, sometimes maybe forgotten, or even, well, occasionally considered forbidden within Christian tradition.
And today we're diving into a text that's absolutely central, a real heavyweight, Book 1 of Augustine's Confessions.
A cornerstone of Western literature, really, and Christian thought.
Definitely. But it's more than just history. Confessions is incredibly personal. It's Augustine speaking, directly to God, mapping out his earliest life and how his spiritual understanding started to form.
Exactly. It's like getting a front row seat to the making of this pivotal theological mind, a spiritual origin story, you could say.
Uh-huh. And our source is Augustine himself, his own really powerful introspective writing from Book 1.
So our goal for this deep dive, we want to trace those early threads, the big themes that run through all his work, sin, grace, that constant search for God, but see how they first appear in his reflections on his own beginnings.
Starting right at the beginning with infancy.
Right. He kicks off Confessions, thinking about being a baby, a time he obviously doesn't remember firsthand. He's relying on what his parents, his nurses, told him.
But even there, in that total dependence, he sees what he calls the comforts of that compassion, specifically like the nourishment from his mother's milk.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? God's care, even before conscious thought.
It really sets up a core Augustinian idea, our complete reliance on God from moment one. It's foundational for his ideas on grace later on. He's careful to say his mother and nurses weren't the source itself, but channels, God providing through them.
And even back then, without memory, he identifies that basic human drive, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain.
Yes, even as an infant, he figures he must have cried for what felt good and protested what hurt. It feels universal, that programming.
We all have that, don't we? That instinct.
Absolutely. And Augustine connects this to that frustration we've maybe all felt as young children not being understood. He sees it as the start of our lifelong attempt to communicate, to connect ultimately with God.
He describes trying to communicate, the sort of random movements, the noises.
Yeah, the flailing and crying, because his inner desires weren't being met by the adults who couldn't, read his mind. That gap between inner need and outer expression.
Which leads him to talk about consciousness slowly dawning.
Right, the shift from just smiling in his sleep to purposeful waking smiles, a sign of growing awareness of the world around him.
And the growing desire to actually express his wishes.
But hitting those limits of communication again, it highlights that gradual journey from just raw sensation to conscious thought, trying to make sense of it all and be understood.
From reflecting on himself, he then shifts to praising God.
Yes, he looks at his own infant body, the senses, and sees God's handiwork. It makes him want to confess, to give praise for that very act of creation.
He sees God as both almighty and good, even in just making him exist.
And he talks about God's unity, the mold of all things, the source of order. It's like he's already building his theology from the ground up, from his own physical being.
Wow. But then, the tone shifts a bit. The shadow of original sin appears.
Yeah, he seems almost hesitant to count infancy as part of his real, lived life because he can't remember it. He compares it to time in the womb.
And then that really stark question comes. If I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me, where was I, thy servant, guiltless?
Wow. So even reflecting on infancy, he's already wrestling with inherited sin. The idea that maybe we're born with this inclination towards wrong, it's a huge theme he develops later, but you see the seeds right there.
It's a heavy concept, the idea that sinfulness is there from conception.
It leads him to wonder about baptism. Why was his delayed?
He questions that common practice. He even quotes that, saying, "Let him alone, let him do as he will, for he is not yet baptized."
It sounds almost like giving kids a free pass for a while.
Exactly. And he contrasts it so sharply with physical health.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say, oh, just let his injury get worse, he's not healed yet.
It's a logical inconsistency he's pointing out. Why the urgency for the body but not the soul, especially early on. Though he does mention his mother, Monica, having a kind of foresight. She thought it might be better to delay baptism until he was older, more formed, perhaps better equipped to face temptations after baptism.
Right, letting the clay face trials before it was fully set in the cast, as he puts it. It touches on debates about when and why baptism is most effective, questions that still echo.
Okay, so from personal beginnings and baptism, he then broadens his view to critique society's values.
And he doesn't hold back. He notes how people get worked up about, say, grammar rules, covenanted rules of letters and syllables, but ignore God's eternal covenant.
The example he uses is striking. Someone mispronouncing a word might offend people more than someone actively hating another person.
It's a sharp observation, isn't it? Prioritizing surface-level correctness over deep moral failings still feels relevant today, that tendency.
And he insists we know better, deep down. There's an innate conscience, that awareness that tells you not to do to others what you wouldn't want done to you.
He calls it an inner record, more fundamental than any learned rule. Yet, despite this inner knowledge, he talks about God allowing a kind of penal blindness. People get so caught up in chasing worldly success, like fame through eloquence.
They become blind to their own lawless desires. It's like the focus on earthly goals can obscure spiritual sight.
This leads him into a really personal period of regret, his 16th year. He calls it the madness of lust.
Yeah, he's deeply sorry for not dedicating his life to God sooner, instead giving in completely to lust, pushed by what he calls human shamelessness.
He even notes his friends were sort of complicit. They cared more about his debating skills, his worldly prospects, than his actual moral state.
A tough realization. But even in those unlawful pleasures, Augustine sees God's hand.
How so?
He describes a bitter alloy mixed in, a kind of merciful harshness. God allowing the negative consequences, jealousy, arguments, fear, to maybe push him towards finding pure, lasting joy only in God.
So even mistakes can contain a nudge towards something better.
That seems to be his point. That internal struggle, the feeling that something's missing even amidst indulgence, it runs all through Confessions. The heart is restless, searching even when it's looking in the wrong places.
He then pauses to wonder why recalling these past sins doesn't horrify him more.
And he credits God's grace and mercy entirely. Forgiveness in preventing him from falling further, it's all God's doing, not his own strength.
He asks, who could possibly claim their own purity comes from their own power? Doing so would just lessen the need for God's mercy.
It's a key point about humility and acknowledging our dependence on grace. Recognizing human weakness is crucial.
His journey then takes him physically to Carthage, and spiritually.
Into what he describes as a cauldron of unholy loves that just overwhelmed him.
He says something fascinating. He loved the idea of love, but didn't have a real object for it.
Yes, and he hated himself for not wanting what he truly needed, which was God. It's a deep insight into misdirected desire. He felt a famine of that inward food, thyself, my God, but paradoxically had no appetite for it.
Like a spiritual illness.
Exactly. The soul is sick, he suggests, seeking scraps of satisfaction from sensory things, outward experiences.
He admits defiling friendship with lust, wanting to seem sophisticated, fine and courtly, even while mired in this mess.
He says he fell headlong into the very love he yearned to be trapped by.
But again, he sees God's mercy even here.
Yes, in the form of bitterness injected into the sweetness, the jealousy, the suspicions, the quarrels. These painful parts were God's way of showing him the emptiness of these relationships.
Then there's his fascination with the theater.
Right. He loved the plays, getting deeply invested emotionally in the stories, especially tragic love stories, feeling the characters' joy and sorrow.
And he asks that interesting question. Do we somehow love grief itself?
He links it to our capacity for mercy, for friendship, but he worries how this noble feeling can get twisted, turning from the heavenly clearness of friendship into the torrent of pitch of lust.
He makes a distinction, too, between pity felt for fictional characters in a play and true mercy.
Yes. True mercy, he argues, wants the suffering gone. Theatrical pity might, in a way, enjoy the emotion of sadness itself. He contrasts this with God's pure love for souls, a love that doesn't involve sorrow.
It's a subtle point about different kinds of empathy, perhaps?
Very much so. Then he reflects on his own lack of understanding back then about true inward righteousness, the kind that doesn't just judge by custom or habit.
He uses those great analogies like trying to wear armor incorrectly in an armory or judging God's actions based on human business hours.
They brilliantly show how limited human judgment is when based only on familiar routines or appearances. God's justice is unchanging, he argues, even if specific commands or customs might vary across time.
Which connects to contemporary debates, really, about morality and different cultural norms.
Absolutely. And this leads him to warn against what he calls the false liberty of self-will. The danger of just making up our own rules, setting ourselves up against God's order, this unreal liberty, he calls it.
He says we lose out when we value our own private good more than the good of all, which for him is God.
And he makes a careful distinction here. There's a difference between the sins of someone who is genuinely trying to grow spiritually and Actions that might look bad, but aren't truly sinful because they don't actually offend God or harm society. Perhaps actions fitting for a specific time, or necessary punishments carried out by authorities.
So context and intent matter enormously.
Usually, human judgment often gets it wrong, looking only at the outward show.
Yeah.
God sees the intent, the full circumstances.
And ultimately, he stresses the need to obey God, even when his commands seem unexpected or strange. Any just human society, he argues, is ultimately serving God.
Knowing God's commands is a blessing, he concludes. Because whether we understand the immediate reason or it's about something in the future, everything done by God's servants fits into a divine plan.
So looking back at Book 1, we really see the bedrock of Augustine's thought being laid, don't we?
Absolutely, that fundamental sense of dependence on God right from infancy.
And that raw struggle with desires, with what society values, the early awareness of sin, the first glimmers of needing grace.
And that tumultuous search for love, trying to find fulfillment in the world before realizing it's ultimately found in God.
What really stands out, I think, is his honesty, his vulnerability in sharing these very early, sometimes messy experiences. It makes his journey feel, well, relatable, even now.
Definitely. These reflections, with all their struggles and insights, really pave the way for the massive theological contributions he'd make later.
So here's a final thought for you listening to this. Thinking about Augustine's beginnings, how do your own earliest experiences, maybe those vague feelings or emerging desires you barely recall, how might they have shaped your own search for meaning, for connection?
Consider that tension he describes between earthly attractions and that deeper pull towards something more. Does that echo in your own life? It's a very human struggle, one Augustine captures so powerfully right from the start.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Augustine's Confessions, Book 1.
We hope you'll join us again on Scripture and Shadows, Christianity's hidden canon, as we continue exploring these foundational texts.